Welcome everyone to the video. Welcome to the channel. This video is probably going to be out late Tuesday. It is Tuesday right now. Um, Maybe Wednesday morning. I'll see how this goes. But I had trouble just getting this video together, getting all my thoughts together, putting everything together into a nice script here. And so it is late Tuesday, hence the glasses. But basing this all on a lot of this on the FCC recent rulings that they're making, rules they're setting up regarding uh, items coming into the United States from overseas. And so we're titling this one, We Traded Freedom for Comfort. And, what if the biggest threat to freedom isn't war or corruption or politics? What if we willingly traded pieces of our independence away because life became easier, cheaper products, faster shipping, our smartphones, the convenience is everywhere. America built its identity around freedom, independence, self-reliance, the idea that nobody controls us. But if you look around, most people depend on systems that they don't understand. There are supply chains that we can't even see, technology they can't even repair, platforms they can't, platforms they can't leave, devices that constantly collect information. And now suddenly there's this push to bring manufacturing back to America, rebuild our independence, secure the supply chains and protect our technology, you know, reduce our dependence on other countries like China. And, I understand that and I get it. Because somewhere along the line, we realized that, cheap products came with hidden cost. And it's not just economic cost, but there's security cost, our privacy, psychological cost in all this. And the problem is, I don't know if modern society can actually function without the convenience, systems we've become addicted to, and that's what I'm gonna talk about today. It's not politics, it's not left versus right, but the price of convenience and whether America slowly traded away pieces of its identity, without even realizing it. America has always been sold this image of independence, the American dream, self-made man or woman, the entrepreneur, small business owners, the idea that hard work will eventually create freedom. Even, culturally, Americans tend to pride themselves on individuality. Nobody tells us what to do. Nobody controls us. Freedom above everything. And for a long time, part of that identity was actually backed by reality. American manufactured, enormous amounts of products, steel, cars, electronics, machinery, infrastructure. Entire cities existed because of American industry. And whether people realize it or not, manufacturing creates more than just products. It creates a national confidence. Because when a country can build its own systems, its own technology, its own infrastructure, there's a psychological sense of control. And over time, something changed. Globalization exploded. And from a business perspective, it makes complete sense. Why manufacture products domestically when labor overseas is dramatically cheaper? Why build locally when global supply chains could maximize profits? Not only that, but customers benefited too. You see, TVs are cheap compared to, when they were manufactured here. Cheap phones, cell phones just keep getting cheaper and cheaper every year. Cheap clothing, furniture, electronics, and people got used to it very, very quickly. Entire generations grew up expecting these low prices and instant availability. And honestly, most of us participated in it willingly because it made life easier. This is the part people don't want to admit. Cheap changes behavior. Once society becomes accustomed to low cost convenience, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse that. because modern life is now structured around affordability. Middle class families rely on lower cost products. Working class families rely on lower cost products even more. The global system lowered prices dramatically, but it also created dependency. And dependency changes power. Because once your economy depends heavily on foreign manufacturing, you're no longer fully independent. And this isn't even necessarily about blaming another country. This is about incentives. Corporations followed profit. Consumers followed affordability. The system rewarded cheaper production. And honestly, most people don't think much about it, about the long-term consequences, because everything felt stable until cracks started appearing, supply chain disruptions, the technology shortages, rising geopolitical tension, concerns now over data security, dependence on rare earth minerals, overseas chip manufacturing. Suddenly, governments started realizing something uncomfortable. Convenience may have weakened resilience. And now there's this growing push towards rebuilding domestic manufacturing, reducing foreign dependence. But the problem, modern consumers still expect modern prices. That's the contradiction nobody wants to talk about. People want domestic manufacturing, but they want inexpensive goods. And rebuilding industrial independence is incredibly expensive. It's bigger than manufacturing. This is about modern civilization itself. Convenience always costs something, you know, money, privacy, sometimes independence. You look at technology. Most people carry devices that constantly collect behavioral information, your location, where you're at, your search history, your shopping habits, voice data nowadays, what you're looking at, viewing patterns, what you're looking at on your phone, social interactions, things on social media. And again, most people accepted this trade willingly because the benefits were enormous. Instant communication, navigation, entertainment in your hands, unlimited information, and the social connection we all look for online. Convenience made the trade feel worth it, but slowly people started realizing just how much information they surrendered. And now we live in a strange world where people say they value privacy while voluntarily giving massive amounts of personal information away every single day. Not because they were forced to, because it made life easier. That's important. Most systems of control throughout history relied heavily on force. Modern systems often rely on convenience. That's a completely different psychological structure. But this is really where things get uncomfortable because modern society still psychologically sees itself as independent. But many people are deeply dependent on systems they don't control. Think about how many services people rely on daily. Your internet providers, your cloud systems, digital payments, the online marketplaces, social media. How many streaming services do you have? Navigation, that's a big one for me. Navigation, even ownership itself is changing. You buy digital movies, you don't physically own them. Games can disappear. I I know with music, suddenly music I'm listening to just disappears. I have to go somewhere else to find it. Software is requiring subscriptions. Cars increasingly relying on software ecosystems. The concept of ownership itself is slowly shifting towards access. And maybe younger generations won't even see this as strange because they grew up inside these systems. But us, me, and the or whoever's watching in the older generation will notice it. There was a time when people physically owned more of the systems around them. Now, increasingly, people simply rent access to systems controlled by corporations. And again, it's convenience. Everything comes back to convenience. This is where current events, enter the picture because governments are becoming increasingly concerned about dependence. technology infrastructure, our communication systems, data security, the supply chain. Because when critical systems rely heavily on foreign production or outside control, national vulnerability increases. That's why you're seeing more discussion around domestic manufacturing, chip production, telecommunication security, infrastructure protection, made in America incentives, initiatives. And honestly, I definitely understand the concern because modern society is incredibly interconnected. One disruption can affect millions of people almost instantly. But I also think many people, underestimate how difficult it would be to reverse decades of globalization. You can't restructure entire economic systems overnight without consequences. Rising prices, industries shift, consumers feel pressure, especially the middle class and lower class. The people who already struggle financially are usually the first to feel economic restructuring. That's just reality. And, this may be the most important question. Did convenience fundamentally change society psychologically? Because humans adapt very quickly to comfort. Once people experience instant access, instant deliveries, cheap technology, unlimited entertainment, that becomes the baseline expectation. And when expectations rise, dependency often rises with it. That's why modern inconvenience feels unbearable to many people. I was just dealing with slow internet earlier today. Shipping delays, service outages create panic because society became optimized around constant convenience. And maybe that convenience came with hidden psychological effects too. Shorter attention spans, a lower patience, constant stimulation, dopamine addiction, dependence on algorithms. Everything becomes faster, louder, and more immediate. And eventually people stop asking whether constant convenience is actually healthy. This is where I think things become philosophical because throughout history, freedom usually isn't surrendered all at once. It's traded away gradually. There are small compromises, small convenience, small comforts. And over time, people normalize dependence because it feels beneficial in the short term. That doesn't mean technology is evil or globalization is either or convenience is evil. That's not really what I'm saying, but every system has trade offs. And I think modern society rarely discusses the spiritual side of dependence because independence isn't just economic, it's psychological, spiritual, it's personal responsibility. And maybe one reason people feel increasingly anxious today is because so much of modern life feels outside individual control. Algorithms shape information, corporations are shaping behavior, governments shape policy, platforms shape communication, and individuals increasingly feel small inside enormous systems. That feeling matters psychologically. Um, Here's the question nobody really knows the answer to is can modern society really go backward? Can we realistically rebuild self-reliance after decades of dependence? Can Americans maintain the lifestyle that we've become accustomed to while dramatically restructuring manufacturing and supply chains? I mean, maybe partially, but I think people underestimate how deeply interconnected the modern world has become. This isn't just economics anymore, it's identity. Modern society became emotionally attached to convenience. And once dependency becomes normalized, breaking that dependency becomes painful. That applies to individuals and it applies to entire countries. Maybe the real question isn't whether globalization was entirely good or entirely bad. Maybe the real question is whether we understood the trade we were making because cheap products weren't actually free. Convenience wasn't actually free. Instead, access wasn't free. Every system has a cost. And maybe over time, America slowly traded pieces of independence away for comfort, speed, affordability, for convenience, because not because people were evil, not because people were, lack of better words, we weren't stupid, because humans naturally move towards comfort. The problem is comfort can quietly create dependency, and dependency changes power. Maybe that's why people feel uneasy right now, not just economically, but psychologically. Because deep down, many people sense the systems they rely on are far bigger than they are. And, rebuilding independence, may be far more difficult than losing it ever was. And maybe that's the real price. That's the real price of convenience. Um, I hope that all made sense. I hope the message comes through and helps people to think a little bit more. Again, drop your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Like the video by hitting the thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to continue to get content from me and you enjoy what I'm talking about. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.